The dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the last war museum. Tom Wilson adjusted his worn leather jacket and checked his watch one final time. In 3 hours he would lock these doors forever and walk away from 30 years of his life's work. The Galactic Council had made their decision clear. War museums were unhealthy, reminders of a barbaric past that had no place in civilized society. His final tour group consisted of 12 visitors from the Centauri Trade Guild, their pale blue skin shimmering under the artificial lighting. They moved through the exhibits with visible discomfort, their large eyes darting away from displays of ancient human weapons and battle armor. One of them, a tall female named Lyra, had already asked twice why humans would preserve such disturbing artifacts. Tom led them past the medieval section where swords and shields hung behind protective glass. The aliens whispered among themselves in their melodic language, clearly disturbed by the craftsmanship that had gone into tools designed solely for killing. He paused before a display showing the evolution of human warfare from stone axes to energy weapons. "Your species created implements whose only purpose was to end life," observed Keth, the trade delegation's leader. His voice carried the typical Centauri tone of polite disapproval. "How did you ever achieve peaceful space travel with such violent inclinations?" Tom smiled, an expression that seemed to make the aliens even more uncomfortable. "We learned that. Sometimes violence prevents greater violence. Sometimes you have to fight to protect what matters most." The group moved into the World War section where holographic displays showed massive battles across Earth's continents. The aliens clustered together, their discomfort growing as Tom explained concepts like strategic bombing and amphibious assaults. One young Centauri actually left the group and waited outside when they reached the nuclear warfare exhibit. "This is exactly why the Council voted to close these facilities," Lyra said, her voice tight with emotion. "Dwelling on such darkness cannot be healthy for any species. You should focus on your achievements in art, science, and peaceful exploration." Tom nodded thoughtfully as he led them through the final section dedicated to humanity's last major conflict 3 centuries ago. The displays here showed how humans had transitioned from warriors to explorers, beating their swords into starships and joining the galactic community. The aliens seemed more comfortable here, approving of humanity's evolution towards civilization. "But we kept the records," Tom said quietly, as they stood before the memorial wall listing every human war in history. Every battle plan, every tactical manual, every lesson learned through blood and sacrifice. We preserved it all because we understood something the rest of the galaxy seems to have forgotten. Keth tilted his head, a gesture that indicated confusion. In Centauri body language, what could possibly be worth remembering about such terrible times? Before Tom could answer, every communication device in the building began shrieking with emergency alerts. The aliens jumped back in alarm as holographic displays materialized throughout the museum, showing incoming transmissions from across the galaxy. Tom's weathered face went pale as he read the scrolling text. The outer rim systems were going dark. Sigma Colony had stopped transmitting 6 hours ago. The research station at Beta Centauri was broadcasting automated distress signals. Before it too fell silent, long-range sensors detected massive objects moving through space, consuming everything in their path. "What is happening?" Lyra's voice cracked with fear as more reports flooded in. Entire worlds were vanishing from the communication grid, leaving only empty space where thriving colonies had existed moments before. Tom's hands moved across his tablet, accessing restricted military databases that hadn't been opened in decades. His face grew grim as classified intelligence reports painted a picture of mechanical entities that devoured organic matter and converted it into fuel for their expansion. The attacking force showed no interest in communication or negotiation. They simply consumed and moved on. The Centauri delegation huddled together, their peaceful worldview crumbling as they watched star systems disappear from the galactic map. These were beings who had solved every conflict through dialogue and compromise for over 1,000 years. The concept of an enemy that could not be reasoned with was literally unthinkable to them. "The Grand Council is calling an emergency session," Keth managed to say, his voice shaking. Surely our diplomats can find a peaceful solution. There must be some way to communicate with these entities. Tom looked at the aliens with something approaching pity. He walked over to a sealed cabinet marked with biometric locks and pressed his palm against the scanner. The case opened to reveal a collection of tactical manuals and strategic analyses that predated the Galactic Peace Accords. Books on warfare that were supposed to have been destroyed centuries ago. You want to know why we kept all this? Tom asked, gesturing at the museum around them. Because we knew this day would come. Not the specific threat, but something like it. We understood that peace is not the natural state of the universe. It's something you have to fight for, something you have to be prepared to defend. The aliens stared at him in horror as he began, pulling ancient military texts from storage containers throughout the museum. Maps of defensive positions, analyses of supply chain warfare, psychological profiles of different combat scenarios. Knowledge that every other species had deliberately forgotten in their pursuit of eternal peace. You're talking about war, Lyra whispered. Actual organized violence between thinking beings, that's not possible anymore. We've evolved beyond such primitive behavior. Tom's laugh was dry and humorless. Tell that to whatever's eating our colonies. He activated his communication array and began sending messages to human settlements across the galaxy. I'm calling in every military historian, every tactical analyst, every human who ever studied the art of war as an academic curiosity, because right now we're the only species in the galaxy who remembers how to fight. The emergency broadcasts continued streaming in as more systems went dark. The things attacking the galaxy were learning from each encounter, adapting their tactics, and growing stronger with every world they consumed. The peaceful civilizations that had thrived for millennia were helpless against an enemy that operated outside their understanding of rational behavior. As the Centauri delegation fled the museum in terror, Tom began packing the most important tactical manuals into transport cases. Tomorrow morning he would present himself to the Galactic Council as humanity's military advisor. They would probably reject his offer at first, clinging to their belief that any problem could be solved through peaceful negotiation. But when the Devourers reached the core systems and the Council's diplomats realized their words meant nothing to machines that fed on organic matter, they would remember the one species that had preserved the knowledge of warfare. They would come looking for the humans who had never forgotten that sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to be prepared for war. Tom Wilson locked the museum doors and walked into the night, carrying humanity's deadliest knowledge toward what might be the galaxy's final hope for survival. The great assembly hall of Nexus Station buzzed with panicked voices as representatives from 12 species tried to make sense of reports that defied everything they understood about civilized behavior. Chancellor Vrex stood at the central podium, his insectoid features twitching with stress as he called for order in a room where order had already collapsed. 7 star systems had gone completely dark in the past 18 hours. The monitoring stations that had tracked every ship movement in the galaxy for centuries were detecting massive signatures moving through space at impossible speeds. Whatever was out there wasn't just attacking colonies, it was consuming them entirely and leaving nothing but empty void. Where worlds used to exist, High Diplomat Thane of the Crystal Collective raised his crystalline appendage to speak. His species had resolved conflicts through meditation and philosophical discussion for over 2,000 years. We must establish communication protocols immediately, he announced in his resonant voice. Every thinking entity has needs and desires that can be addressed through proper negotiation. Admiral Zor of the Aquatic Federation's gills fluttered nervously as he studied the tactical displays floating above the assembly floor. His people lived in vast underwater cities and had never engaged in anything more violent than competitive swimming. The energy signatures suggest industrial-level construction in the consumed systems, he reported. Perhaps they simply require raw materials for some great project. The assembled delegates nodded hopefully at this possibility. If the attackers were builders rather than destroyers, then surely some arrangement could be reached. Resources could be shared, territories could be negotiated, and the galactic peace could be preserved through careful diplomacy. Ambassador Linda Hayes sat quietly in the human delegation section, watching her fellow representatives cling to solutions that made no sense given the evidence. As a former military historian, she had spent decades studying conflicts that the rest of the galaxy preferred to forget. The pattern emerging from the outer rim looked nothing like the territorial disputes or resource conflicts that had shaped galactic politics for millennia. Military analyst Rix of the Technical Union activated a holographic display showing projections based on the current rate of system consumption. The mathematical models painted a horrifying picture of exponential expansion that would reach the galactic core within months. Several delegates required medical attention when they saw the casualty estimates. The projection assumes continued expansion at current rates, Rix explained in his mechanical voice. If the entities maintain their consumption pattern, organic life in this galaxy will be extinct within 2 standard years. The hall erupted in chaos as representatives demanded better numbers, more optimistic scenarios, anything that would make the impossible situation seem manageable. Chancellor Vrex's compound eyes searched the room desperately, looking for someone who might have answers that didn't involve the complete destruction of everything they had built. Linda Hayes stood slowly, her movement cutting through the noise like a blade. At 62 years old, she had the weathered appearance of someone who had spent her life studying humanity's violent past while her species embraced peaceful exploration. The assembly hall gradually fell silent as she walked to the speaking platform. "You're all missing the point," she said quietly, her words carrying clearly through the acoustic systems. "This isn't a diplomatic crisis. This isn't a resource dispute. This isn't a territorial conflict. This is war." The word hit the assembly like a physical blow. Several delegates actually stepped backward as if Linda had threatened them personally. War was not just forbidden in civilized discourse, it was considered a form of mental illness that had been cured through thousands of years of social evolution. Chancellor Vrex's antennae quivered with obvious distaste. "Ambassador Hayes, surely you cannot suggest abandoning millennia of peaceful development to embrace primitive violence. We are civilized beings who resolve conflicts through reason and understanding." Linda activated her personal display unit, showing intelligence reports that painted a clear picture of mechanical entities that converted organic matter into construction materials for their own expansion. "These things don't want territory, they don't want resources. They want to eat us and turn us into more of themselves. There's nothing to negotiate because we are not negotiating partners to them, we are food." The Crystal Collective delegates began their harmonic humming that indicated extreme stress. The Aquatic Federation representatives were making clicking sounds that meant their collective decision-making process was breaking down. The peaceful species that had eliminated warfare from their cultures had no mental framework for processing an existential threat. "Even if your analysis is correct," said Trade Minister Bex of the Commercial Confederation, "our combined fleets number in the hundreds of thousands. Surely our technological superiority can overcome any primitive aggressors." Linda pulled up the fleet composition reports and shook her head grimly. "Our ships are designed for exploration, scientific research, and ceremonial displays. They have minimal defensive systems and no offensive capability beyond mining lasers and construction tools. We spent 3,000 years optimizing for everything except the one thing we need right now." The uncomfortable truth settled over the assembly like a heavy blanket. The galactic civilization that had achieved unprecedented peace and prosperity had done so by systematically eliminating their ability to defend themselves. They had created a paradise that was completely vulnerable to anyone willing to use violence. "What do you propose?" Chancellor Vrex asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be unacceptable. Linda gestured toward the tactical displays showing the advancing threat. "We need to remember how to fight. We need to access historical military databases, recruit personnel with combat experience, and convert our civilian infrastructure for warfare. And we need to do it fast because these things learn from every encounter." The suggestion sent shockwaves through the assembly. Delegates from species that had bred aggression out of their genetics centuries ago were being asked to embrace the very behaviors they considered primitive and dangerous. It was like asking them to voluntarily contract a psychological disease. The human delegation has maintained detailed records of military tactics and strategic planning, Linda continued, ignoring the horrified expressions around her. We can provide training materials, tactical analyses, and personnel who understand warfare as an academic discipline. But you need to understand what you're asking us to become. She activated a final display showing humanity's military history, from their tribal conflicts to their final war 3 centuries ago. The progression of human warfare technology and tactics played out in holographic detail, showing a species that had turned violence into a sophisticated art form before voluntarily setting it aside. You're asking us to wake up the part of humanity that every other species finds disturbing, Linda said quietly. The part that sees impossible odds as an interesting challenge, the part that plans for victory while preparing for death, the part that laughs in the face of extinction. The assembly hall fell completely silent as the implications sank in. They were asking the galaxy's former warriors to remember how to be warriors again. They were trading their peaceful paradise for the slim chance of survival in a universe that had suddenly become hostile. Chancellor Vrex looked around the hall at his fellow representatives, seeing fear and desperation in every face. The comfortable illusions of permanent peace were crumbling under the weight of a reality that cared nothing for their philosophical achievements. The Council will vote on establishing a historical defense initiative under human guidance, he announced, his voice heavy with the knowledge that they were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. May the ancestors forgive us for what we are about to become? Linda Hayes nodded grimly as she gathered her materials. In a few hours, she would be leading the galaxy's first military planning session in over 1,000 years. She would be teaching peaceful species how to kill efficiently and die meaningfully. She would be awakening the sleeping giant of human warfare, and somewhere in the darkness between the stars, the Devourers continued their relentless advance toward the galaxy's heart. The emergency command center aboard Nexus Station resembled a medical facility more than a military headquarters. Half the alien officials required regular psychological counseling sessions to cope with concepts like acceptable casualty rates and strategic target prioritization. The other half had requested sedatives to help them sleep after their first exposure to human military planning sessions. Tom Wilson arrived carrying nothing but a single data pad and a lifetime of knowledge that the galaxy had tried to forget. The old museum curator looked around the hastily assembled room where beings from 12 different species sat in uncomfortable silence, waiting to learn how to kill efficiently. The irony was not lost on him that he was teaching warfare in a space station designed to promote eternal peace. Professor Emma Cross materialized on the holographic communication system from her research facility on Mars. The logistics expert had spent 40 years studying supply chain management as an abstract intellectual exercise, never imagining she would be calculating ammunition requirements and medical evacuation protocols for actual combat operations. Her academic analysis of resource distribution during historical conflicts had suddenly become a survival manual for galactic civilization. Retired Colonel David Park entered the briefing room with the measured stride of someone who had never actually fought in a war but had spent decades thinking about how wars should be fought. His theoretical knowledge of combined arms tactics and strategic positioning was about to be tested against an enemy that adapted and evolved with every encounter. "The first thing you need to understand," Tom announced to the assembled representatives, "is that everything you think you know about conflict resolution is wrong. You've been trained to see other beings as rational actors with understandable motivations. The Devourers are not other beings. They are a mathematical process with teeth." Ambassador Kral of the Hegemony Council shifted uncomfortably in his specially designed chair. His species had achieved interstellar travel by developing perfect social harmony and collective decision-making. Surely there must be some underlying logic to their behavior. Even machines operate according to programmed objectives. Emma's holographic image leaned forward, displaying resource consumption models on the central screen. Their objective is expansion through consumption. They convert organic matter into construction materials and energy storage. From their perspective, we are not intelligent life forms deserving of consideration. We are renewable resources that happen to be self-organizing. The blunt assessment sent visible shudders through the alien delegates. Species that had spent millennia developing empathy and understanding were being forced to contemplate an enemy that viewed them as nothing more than raw materials for industrial processes. Colonel Park activated the tactical display showing the Devourer's advancement pattern through the outer rim systems. They're learning from every encounter. Early reports showed simple consumption behavior, but recent intelligence indicates sophisticated battlefield adaptation. They modify their tactics based on defensive responses and improve their technology using captured materials. How is that possible? Asked Science Coordinator Vel of the Research Collective. Even the most advanced artificial intelligence requires time to process new information and develop responses. David's expression grew grim as he highlighted specific battle reports. They're not processing information sequentially like our computers. They appear to be operating as a distributed intelligence that shares knowledge instantaneously across their entire force. Every unit learns from every encounter simultaneously. The implications of fighting an enemy that grew smarter with every battle sent the already nervous delegates into near panic. Several representatives from the peaceful agricultural worlds began discussing evacuation plans for their populations. The Crystal Collective delegates entered their meditative trance state and refused to participate further. Linda Hayes entered the briefing room carrying armloads of ancient military manuals that had been sealed in storage for centuries. The weight of human military knowledge, preserved against the day when it might be needed again, settled onto the conference table like a physical presence. "This is what we're dealing with," she said, opening a tactical analysis of adaptive military technology. "The good news is that humanity fought similar enemies during our early space expansion. Automated defense systems that learned from attacks and modified their responses. We developed countermeasures." Tom smiled grimly as he pulled up historical battle records from humanity's colonial period. "The bad news is that those countermeasures require a mindset that most of you find morally objectionable. We had to think like the machines to beat them. We had to become more ruthless and unpredictable than our enemies." The alien delegates stared at displays showing human tactical doctrines based on controlled chaos and purposeful unpredictability. Military strategies that embraced uncertainty and turned apparent weaknesses into tactical advantages. Warfare concepts that required soldiers to make split-second decisions without central coordination. Your species developed individual initiative. In combat situations, observed military analyst Rix, our collective decision-making processes cannot operate at such speeds. How do we adapt social structures that require group consensus to situations demanding immediate individual action? Emma brought up logistics charts showing how human military units operated with minimal supply lines and maximum flexibility. You'll need to decentralize command authority and train individual units to operate independently. That means giving up the collective harmony that defines your civilizations. The suggestion horrified representatives from species that had eliminated individual violence by making every decision through group consensus. They were being asked to abandon the social evolution that had lifted them from primitive tribalism to advanced galactic citizenship. "We're asking you to temporarily become something you've spent thousands of years learning not to be," Linda admitted, "but the alternative is extinction. The Devourers don't care about your social achievements or philosophical development. They care about biomass conversion rates." The briefing continued for 18 hours as human advisors introduced concepts that made their alien students physically ill. Kill ratios, target prioritization, acceptable losses, strategic deception, and psychological warfare. Knowledge that humanity had preserved not out of nostalgia for their violent past, but out of understanding that peace was a luxury that could be taken away. By the end of the session, 3 species had withdrawn from the defense initiative entirely and requested immediate evacuation to the galactic periphery. The remaining delegates sat in stunned silence, trying to process tactical information that contradicted everything they believed about civilized behavior. Ambassador Kral stared at the tactical manuals spread across the conference table. If we do this, if we embrace these methods, what prevents us from becoming monsters ourselves? How do we return to peaceful civilization after learning to think like killers? Tom Wilson closed the ancient books and looked around the room at beings who were being forced to confront the darkest aspects of survival. That's the burden every warrior carries. You learn to do terrible things so that others don't have to. You become capable of violence so that violence becomes unnecessary. As the briefing ended and the delegates returned to their quarters to process what they had learned, emergency reports continued streaming in from the outer systems. The Devourers had accelerated their expansion and were now consuming entire sectors in days rather than weeks. The window for organizing effective resistance was closing rapidly. In the command center, human advisors worked through the night converting peaceful exploration vessels into instruments of war. They taught civilian engineers how to manufacture weapons and trained diplomatic personnel in psychological warfare techniques. They awakened knowledge that the galaxy had deliberately forgotten. And in the darkness beyond the galactic rim, something vast and hungry noticed that the food was beginning to organize itself for resistance. The Devourers began adapting their tactics for a more challenging harvest, unaware that they were facing the one species that had turned war into an art form and then voluntarily set it aside. The sleeping giant of human military capability was stirring, and the galaxy would never be the same. The message had spread across human space like wildfire through dry grass. Every colony, every space station, every settlement that humanity had established in their 3 centuries of peaceful expansion received the same urgent transmission. The galaxy needed warriors again, and humanity was the only species that remembered how to answer that call. They came from asteroid mining operations, where crews had learned to work with explosives in zero gravity. They arrived from deep space. Rescue services where pilots had developed skills for flying through dangerous conditions without backup. Construction engineers who understood structural weaknesses reported for duty alongside cargo haulers, who knew how to move massive amounts of material quickly and quietly. Rita Stone had been coordinating emergency rescues in the dangerous space lanes near the galactic rim when the call came. Her civilian transport vessel had pulled survivors from more than 50 disasters over the past decade, giving her experience with crisis management and split-second decision-making that most humans had never needed. Now she found herself commanding the first integrated human-alien battle group in galactic history. The hastily converted warship New Dawn bore little resemblance to its original design as a scientific research vessel. Human engineers had worked around the clock, welding armor, plating over observation decks, and converting laboratory spaces into weapons manufacturing facilities. The hydroponics bay now produced ammunition instead of vegetables, and the crew quarters had been redesigned to accommodate combat casualties. General Viss of the Hegemony Council watched the transformation with a mixture of fascination and horror. His species had achieved interstellar travel through perfect social cooperation and had never seen individuals work with such focused intensity. The humans aboard his ship seemed to operate on a different level of urgency, as if they understood something about the situation that his own people had missed. They converted the stellar cartography lab into a tactical planning center. Viss reported to his superiors during his daily briefing. They're teaching my navigation specialists to think about star systems as defensive positions rather than scientific phenomena. The conceptual shift is extraordinary and deeply disturbing. The training exercises that followed challenged every assumption the galactic species held about proper behavior. Human instructors demonstrated combat techniques that required individual initiative and independent thinking. They taught aliens to lie convincingly during interrogation scenarios and to calculate the acceptable cost of mission success in terms of crew casualties, What surprised everyone was how quickly the other species adapted once they overcame their initial psychological barriers. The methodical Crystal Collective began developing battle computers that could process tactical information faster than any organic mind. Their crystalline thought processes, once focused on philosophical contemplation, proved devastatingly effective at calculating optimal weapon targeting solutions. The Aquatic Federation discovered that their natural three-dimensional thinking made them exceptional void tacticians. Living in underwater cities had given them an intuitive understanding of movement in three-dimensional space that translated perfectly to space combat. Their fluid approach to formation flying confused even the human instructors who had designed the training programs. Even the peaceful Centauri found their talents for electronic communication could be weaponized into sophisticated jamming and interception systems. Their ability to harmonize multiple signals simultaneously made them natural electronic warfare specialists, capable of disrupting enemy communications while maintaining perfect coordination among friendly forces, but it was humanity that served as the catalyst for these transformations. Where other species learned to fight, humans remembered what they had always been underneath centuries of peaceful civilization. They began displaying the peculiar human trait of finding humor in desperate situations, laughing at tactical briefings that described impossible odds and volunteering for suicide missions with enthusiasm that disturbed their alien comrades. The first combat engagement took place near the Vega system when a mixed battle group encountered a Devourer scouting force. The enemy machines had been expecting the disorganized resistance they had faced in previous encounters, but instead found themselves facing coordinated tactics that their adaptive systems couldn't predict or counter. Captain Rita Stone commanded the engagement from the bridge of her converted research vessel, watching as human unpredictability combined with alien technological superiority in ways that defied conventional military doctrine. Her crew had been trained to embrace controlled chaos, making decisions that seemed random but followed underlying patterns that the machine intelligence couldn't decode. All units, execute pattern Omega-7, Rita ordered, knowing that half her alien crews had no idea what Omega-7 actually meant. That was the point? The humans had developed tactical codes that relied on cultural understanding rather than precise definitions, creating communication systems that were incomprehensible to outside observers. The Devourer scouts attempted to adapt their formations to counter what they perceived as the human battle plan, but found themselves constantly reacting to tactics that changed faster than their processing systems could analyze. When the enemy tried to predict human behavior based on logical military doctrine, the humans switched to seemingly irrational maneuvers that achieved their objectives through pure audacity. The engagement lasted only 47 minutes, but it ended with something unprecedented in the history of the Devourer expansion. The machine intelligence withdrew from a battle, retreating to analyze an opponent that had demonstrated capabilities outside their experience parameters. For the first time since the invasion began, the unstoppable force had encountered something it couldn't immediately overcome. News of the victory spread through the galaxy faster than the official military reports. Civilian populations that had been preparing for evacuation began talking about resistance instead of retreat. The impossible had happened, and suddenly the galaxy began to hope again. In the aftermath of the battle, human behavior patterns began spreading through the other species like a beneficial infection. Alien crews started displaying initiative and individual decision-making skills that their societies had not seen in centuries. They began planning for contingencies and developing backup systems for their backup systems. More importantly, they began to laugh. The peculiar human response to stress and danger proved contagious, spreading through the integrated crews as they discovered the psychological benefits of finding humor in desperate situations. Laughter became a weapon against fear, a way of maintaining morale when facing overwhelming odds. Tom Wilson received reports from training centers across the galaxy describing transformations that went beyond simple military preparation. Species that had eliminated competition from their cultures were rediscovering the benefits of healthy rivalry. Beings that had bred aggression out of their genetics were learning that controlled aggression could be a survival trait rather than a character flaw. "We're not just teaching them to fight," he reported to Linda Hayes during their weekly strategic review. "We're teaching them to be dangerous. And they're discovering that being dangerous can be fun." The psychological shift represented more than just military preparation. The galaxy was remembering skills and attitudes that had been deliberately suppressed in the pursuit of perfect peace. They were rediscovering the warrior spirit that had originally lifted them from their homeworlds to explore the stars. As more battle groups formed and training intensified, the Devourers began adapting their own tactics to counter the unexpected resistance. Intelligence reports indicated massive construction projects in the consumed systems, suggesting that the machine intelligence was preparing for a more serious confrontation than their initial harvesting operations had anticipated. The galaxy was changing, transforming from a peaceful confederation of philosophical civilizations into something harder and more resilient. The sleeping giant of their collective warrior heritage was awakening, guided by humanity's preserved knowledge of warfare and tempered by their understanding that some things were worth fighting for. In the darkness beyond the stars, ancient machines calculated new probabilities and began constructing weapons designed for war rather than simple consumption. The harvest had become complicated, but the Devourers had learned to adapt to every challenge they had encountered in their expansion across the universe. They had never encountered anything quite like a galaxy that had learned to laugh in the face of extinction while simultaneously preparing for the largest military operation in recorded history. The final confrontation was approaching, and both sides were discovering capabilities they had never known they possessed. The final battle would be decided at Nexus Station, the symbolic heart of galactic civilization, where 12 species had gathered for centuries to maintain their hard-won peace. Now that same station served as the command center for the largest military operation in recorded history, surrounded by a fleet that represented the combined defensive capability of every inhabited world in the galaxy. Admiral Linda Hayes stood before the massive tactical display in the command center, watching as sensor readings updated the positions of nearly 2 million vessels arranged in defensive formations around the system. Ships that had been designed for exploration and scientific research now bristled with weapons cobbled together from mining equipment and industrial tools. The transformation was impressive, but everyone knew it might not be enough. The enemy, approaching their position, defied every previous encounter with the Devourers. Long-range sensors detected a single massive construct the size of a small moon, accompanied by manufacturing vessels that were building additional units even as they traveled through space. Intelligence analysis suggested that the machine intelligence had learned from every battle and was bringing everything it had discovered about organic tactics to this final confrontation. Tom Wilson, now serving as Chief Strategic Advisor to the Galactic Defense Force, presented the latest intelligence assessment to the assembled fleet commanders. The old museum curator had never imagined that his preserved knowledge of human warfare would be needed to defend galactic civilization, but he had adapted to his new role with the same quiet competence that had made him an effective historian. The Devour world ship contains the computational power of 7 consumed star systems, he announced to the crowded briefing room. It has processed every tactical engagement we've fought over the past year and developed countermeasures for every strategy we've employed. By any logical analysis, we cannot win this battle. The assembled commanders, both human and alien, absorbed this information with the calm professionalism that had developed during months of intensive combat training. The mixed crews had learned to work together despite fundamental differences in their approaches to warfare, creating battle groups that combined human unpredictability with alien technological superiority. Captain Rita Stone, now commanding a battle group of 30 converted civilian vessels, studied the tactical projections with the same focused intensity she had once applied to emergency rescue operations. Her experience coordinating desperate situations with insufficient resources had proven invaluable in preparing for a battle. where the enemy possessed overwhelming advantages in both numbers and technology. The enemy will expect us to fight defensively. Around the station, she observed, highlighting the predicted battle formations on her personal display. They've seen us use protective tactics in previous engagements and have developed strategies to counter defensive positioning. General Viss nodded in agreement, his compound eyes reflecting the tactical displays around the briefing room. The Hegemony Council officer had undergone the same psychological transformation as his crews, learning to think in terms of acceptable losses and strategic objectives, rather than the collective harmony that had once defined his species. Our advantage lies in the unpredictability that they cannot adapt to quickly enough, he added, speaking with an authority that would have been impossible for his people before they learned to embrace individual initiative. The question is whether we can maintain that advantage long enough to achieve victory. Professor Emma Cross appeared on the holographic communication system from her logistics coordination center deep within Nexus Station. The academic who had once studied supply chain management as an intellectual exercise now controlled the resource flow for the largest military operation in galactic history, ensuring that ammunition and medical supplies reached the right locations at precisely the right moments. The manufacturing analysis is complete, she reported, displaying production statistics that showed the incredible industrial mobilization that had transformed the galaxy over the past year. We have sufficient ammunition for approximately 6 hours of sustained combat, assuming standard consumption rates. The briefing continued with reports from every aspect of the defensive preparation: medical evacuation protocols, communication backup systems, contingency plans for retreat and regrouping. Every detail had been planned and rehearsed, but everyone understood that the actual battle would probably render most of their preparations useless within the first few minutes. As the formal briefing concluded and the commanders prepared to return to their vessels, something remarkable happened. Captain Rita Stone began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, but the sound cut through the tension in the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The laughter spread among the human officers first, then began affecting their alien comrades as the absurdity of their situation became clear. They were preparing to fight an enemy that possessed overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. Their chances of victory were mathematically insignificant. Their entire civilization would probably be extinct within days. And somehow that struck them as hilarious. "What is so amusing about our impending destruction?" asked Colonel Park, though his own expression suggested he was beginning to understand the joke that had infected the room. Rita wiped tears from her eyes as she gestured at the tactical displays, showing impossible odds and certain defeat. "Don't you see what they've done? They've created the perfect scenario for human military doctrine. Overwhelming enemy forces, impossible objectives, certain death, and the fate of everything we care about hanging in the balance." General Viss tilted his head in the gesture that indicated confusion in his species, but his voice carried a note of understanding. "You find these conditions favorable?" "We find these conditions familiar," Admiral Hayes replied, her own smile spreading as she realized what her people were experiencing. "This is exactly the kind of situation where humans do their best work. When everything looks hopeless, when the smart money says to give up, when any reasonable person would surrender, that's when we get creative." The battle began 18 hours later with the arrival of the Devourer world ship at the edge of the Nexus system. The massive construct dwarfed everything the galactic species had ever built, its surface covered with manufacturing facilities that continued producing attack vessels even as it moved into combat range. The sight should have been terrifying, but the human crews responded with the same inappropriate humor that had sustained their species through every impossible situation in their history. "Well, that's bigger than expected," Rita announced over the fleet communication system as her sensors registered the enemy's true size. "Anyone have a really big hammer?" The opening phase of the engagement followed predictable patterns as the Devourer forces deployed in formations designed to counter the defensive tactics they had observed in previous battles. Their adaptive systems had calculated optimal approaches for overwhelming fixed positions while minimizing their own losses. They had not calculated for the possibility that the defenders would abandon their carefully prepared positions and charge directly at the enemy fleet while broadcasting human war songs across all communication frequencies. The first wave of the Galactic Defense Force hit the Devourer formations. Like a chaotic storm of individual initiatives and coordinated madness, human battle groups used tactics so random that their own allies couldn't predict their movements, while alien crews executed maneuvers that defied both physics and common sense. Captain Rita Stone led her battle group in a spiraling attack pattern that her tactical computer insisted was mathematically impossible. Her crews had learned to trust human intuition over mechanical logic, following orders that seemed insane until the moment they produced unexpected victories against superior opponents. "All units, execute the Wilson maneuver," she ordered, knowing that Tom Wilson had never actually designed a tactical maneuver, and that her crews would have to improvise whatever they thought the Wilson maneuver should be. The resulting attack pattern looked like controlled chaos to outside observers, but achieved perfect coordination through shared understanding rather than rigid planning. Human crews responded to situations based on cultural instincts that their alien comrades had learned to trust even when they couldn't understand the underlying logic. The Devourer adaptive system struggled to counter tactics that changed faster than they could be analyzed. When the machines attempted to predict human behavior based on military doctrine, the humans switched to pure improvisation. When the artificial intelligence tried to model organic psychology, the humans did things that made no sense to any rational observer. General Viss commanded his battle group with a combination of hegemony, council precision, and human audacity that would have been impossible for his species a year earlier. His crews had learned to embrace individual decision-making, while maintaining the collective coordination that made them effective in three-dimensional combat. "They're adapting to our adaptive responses," he reported as the enemy formations began showing signs of learning from the chaotic human tactics. "The machines are trying to out-evolve our evolution." "Then we stop evolving and start revolving," Admiral Hayes replied, ordering a tactical shift that abandoned all pretense of conventional military strategy. "All units implement Operation Carnival. Make it up as you go along and trust your neighbors to figure out how to help." Operation Carnival was not a real tactical plan, but rather an instruction for every crew to do whatever seemed like a good idea while assuming that everyone else would do the same. The result was a level of coordinated chaos that defied analysis by any intelligence, artificial or organic. Human engineering crews performed impossible repairs while under direct fire, welding hull patches while their ships maneuvered at combat speed. Alien pilots executed maneuvers that their safety systems insisted would destroy their vessels, trusting human assurances that sometimes impossible was just another word for unexpected. The battle raged for 16 hours as both sides discovered capabilities they had never known they possessed. The Devourers revealed construction technologies that could build new attack units from battlefield debris, while the galactic forces demonstrated the peculiar organic ability to become more effective. As their situation became more desperate, as the enemy world ship moved into close range, its massive bulk casting shadows across the battlefield, something unprecedented happened. The machine intelligence made its first tactical error in the history of its expansion across the universe. It concentrated its manufacturing capability on building larger and more sophisticated attack units, assuming that superior technology would overcome the organic force's unpredictable tactics. Instead, the concentrated manufacturing made the world ship vulnerable to the kind of coordinated strike that required perfect timing and absolute trust between units that had learned to work together despite fundamental differences in their approach to warfare. "All battle groups, converge on the manufacturing sectors," Admiral Hayes ordered, knowing that she was asking her crews to fly directly into the most heavily defended areas of the enemy construct. Make them regret building such an obvious target. The final assault looked like organized suicide to any observer familiar with conventional military tactics. Thousands of small vessels charging directly at a construct the size of a moon, their crews laughing and singing as they flew into weapons fire that should have destroyed them instantly. But the Galactic Defense Force had learned something that the Devourer's adaptive systems couldn't process. They had discovered that beings fighting for everything they cared about could accomplish things that were mathematically impossible, especially when they approached certain death with the peculiar human attitude that impossible odds just made victory more interesting. The world ship's destruction triggered cascade failures throughout the Devourer fleet as the loss of central coordination left individual units unable to adapt to the continuing assault. The machines that had consumed 7 star systems fell to an enemy that fought with laughter instead of fear and treated certain death as an acceptable tactical option. In the aftermath, as the galaxy began the long process of rebuilding and remembering what they had learned about themselves, the story of the final battle became legend. Not just the victory, but the moment when organic life discovered that some things were worth fighting for and some enemies were worth laughing at. The last War Museum reopened as the Galactic Military Academy, with Tom Wilson as its permanent director and a mandate to ensure that the galaxy never again forgot how to defend itself. The peaceful species that had eliminated warfare from their cultures learned to maintain that peace through strength rather than wishful thinking. And throughout human space, in veterans' halls and family gatherings, around dinner tables and in quiet moments of reflection, people told the story of the day when war returned to the galaxy and humanity's response was to smile, roll up their sleeves, and ask the universe if that was really the best it could do. Because some things never change, and some species never lose their sense of humor, even when facing the end of everything they hold dear.